All right, welcome back from break. Let's finish out our section here in chapter 14. This is kind of a theological, turning point here. There's a lot going on. One of the things I want to point out in chapter 14 is how relevant this passage is to the theology of testing. So if you're working on your book report, your book review for this class, this is something that kind of gets developed a little bit in the book that I wrote. But it's the theology of testing. And the reason it's so important, and we see it here in this text, let's take a look at starting in verse 20. What we have to understand is, how is the Lord going to respond to the situation where on the one hand, He's unreservedly committed to this people because of the unconditional promises that He's made to the patriarchs, right? To get them to the land, to bless them and all of those things. But on the other hand, He's dealing with a group of people who are obstinate and stiff-necked, right? You've got two sources, you've got positive and negative charge. You've got, oil and water. You've got, all of these things that we can think about. So the theology of testing and refining now helps us to understand the divine response. That's the point I want you to see here. So the Lord says, "So I've pardoned them according to your word. But indeed, as long as all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord, surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet now have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice, by no means this generation will see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor any of them who spurned me to see it, except a few others." Caleb, Joshua, etc. Now, what we see here is this word testing, and I make the point in the book, but there's only one person who is supposed to be the noun before the verb to test, and that's God. What we see here is the opposite of that. We see God's people testing the Lord. They have been testing Him through the wilderness now, through this murmuring period. They won't get over the murmuring portion of their experience with the Lord. They're stuck. So we've got two generations all mixed together. Well, what we've got to do is figure out what to do with this group. And within any time in history, there's always going to be, although that we don't have them specifically here, but we've got the emerging faithful remnant, although small, it seems. But always within a group, we've got the faithful remnant and then the majority of the unfaithful. What's interesting is this testing idea. As we move into the wilderness, what we see is it's going to take a wilderness experience now to allow one generation to kind of die off and another generation to move in and get reestablished and kind of say oriented in the right way. And that's what we have in the 40 years of wilderness experience. What's interesting is you've got the same identical scenario come up when you've got the takeover of Jerusalem after being in the land. Israel is now going to basically become a situation much like this. You're going to have the majority of unfaithful, those who are out committing idolatry and are basically stuck in that religious syncretism. Guess where the prophets are going to go when the Lord says to Jeremiah, for example, the prophet, when Jeremiah says to this group, everybody in the room, plan A, God's plan A is for all of us to go to Babylon. Everyone. But it'll be for a time, 70 years. And after that time, God will have another plan to allow us to come back. What do you say? How many takers do we have? Have you ever read Jeremiah? That wasn't well received. That's kind of like treason. He's saying that in front of the king. Jeremiah gets thrown in a stockade at the bottom of his cistern. That's where it gets him. But what does happen to this group of people? Out of Jerusalem, they go to Babylon. Guess who God raises up to be their preacher? Right? Ezekiel the prophet. And what we know is, over history, over that 70 years of being in exile. See, that exile in Babylon I equate to the 40 years of wilderness experience for Israel at this time. What we see here is this refining take place. So refinement, now we're back to this gold idea. There's dross that's refined, it rises to the surface, it's skimmed off and discarded, but yet what emerges from this process is the pure gold, and that's the desired result. So out of Babylon, soon to be Persia, 22,000 plus faithful remnant. Now that group's grown. Take that long journey back to Jerusalem. So this is how the Lord responds when He's got a group that's mixed together. Faithful remnant, unfaithful majority. What am I going to do? God says He's reminded here by Moses, but the prophets do the same thing. God, what's the plan A for the faithful remnant? Well, the Lord's not given up on you. It's because He's made this unconditional promise to the patriarchs. He's got a future and a plan for you, the faithful remnant. And it's the day of the Lord theology that starts to spring up. But it builds on this early experience in Israel's history. So that's the connections that I want us to see. And we'll jump ahead just briefly. We'll look at this a little bit later, but Deuteronomy chapter 8, we have this classic summary, theological summation of the exilic experience. We're now 40 years after the fact, 40 years later, we've got the new generation that has been kind of raised up through this refining experience. And, this is where Moses says, here's the whole divine intention behind the experience that you just all came out of. Do you remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you, verse 2, in the wilderness these 40 years, that He might humble you, testing you, right? Refining you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commands or not. He humbled you, He let you be hungry, He fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, so that He might make you understand that the lesson of the wilderness. Man does not live by bread alone. Man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So it's the word of the Lord, it's obedience to that word, it's the experience then of subsequent blessing, provision, protection, guidance, and all of those things that come. And it moves ahead. The Lord didn't take away the adversity that you experienced. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Thus ye are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you just as a man disciplines or a father disciplines his son. That's what a parent does for a child who's complaining too much. That's the answer, not the guy that spoke on the video. No, it's good parenting to respond. I don't even know if we have to listen to the feelings and emotions of our children at any given point. Maybe, but really it's about being unreservedly committed to that child, keeping them out of harm's way, allowing them to get their britches burned occasionally, and when they disobey, taking away privileges. That's good parenting, right? Get ready for that, Adam. And Sarah, if you're watching at home. You have a rebellious child. It happens at age 2, I think. That's what they say, I think, generally. I was blessed with 2 wonderful children. You have a question? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Can we say Moses failed to have a follower?
Did Moses fail?
To have a follower.
Full heart?
Follower. Disciple. People that disciples that they will be able to follow him.
Oh.
Can we say he failed in that aspect? Because out of the 12, only 2 were of the same mind with him.
In terms of the spies?
Yes, in terms of the spies.
Mm-hmm. We don't hear much about these elders. Remember the elders that were appointed to kind of be an extension of Moses' leadership back when he was struggling with having too much to do? Maybe we know a little bit. I'd have to look at it, but we might see some evidence of him multiplying himself in terms of leadership. He's going to delegate some things in terms of not always being the one to call the shots and coming up with the judgments, the decisions with regards to what do we do, A or B. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I don't know if we can fully accuse him for not doing anything, right? So, all right. Well, let's keep moving here. Well, a little bit here in chapter 14 before we move on. So the judgment here, there's a little judgment that's all wrapped up in the refining experience. So there's a little adversity, a little bit of removing of privileges. We're going to see that when we get to the prophets. The prophets are going to raise the awareness of God's judgment, and interestingly, they're going to go back to books like Deuteronomy and what Moses taught with regards to the fork in the road. Moses, when we get to Deuteronomy, is going to map this all out for Israel. If you go to if it's disobedience, here's your future path. He'll predict the exile. He'll be with his prophet's hat on. He'll look into the future and say, if you go this direction, God's going to have a divine response. But if you go this direction, God will have a divine response. And there's a fork in the road. So it's woven throughout all of Israel's history. Verse 28, say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. So he's referring to the judgment. Your corpses shall fall in this wilderness. People will die, of course, generation A to generation B. Even all your numbered men, according to the completed number, from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. Your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in, and they shall know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses shall fall in the wilderness. So there is a little bit of emphasis there on the theology of the death wail, I call it. Some will die in the wilderness, but natural causes, maybe some adversity experienced, some disease, sickness, we don't know all the details, but generation A will move to generation B. And then we'll have the wilderness generation, and that's the generation that Moses will address on the plains of Moab, just on the verge of taking the land. All right? So that's where we're going. We're getting close to the end here of the book of Numbers. I've got a couple things that we need to talk about. So near the end of the wilderness wanderings, now we're not covering the chapters that are focusing on the being in the wilderness. Israel is approaching the eastern border of the Promised Land. And interestingly, as she gets close, she's going to encounter opposition from two kings. We have King Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. The word Amorites, I think in this context, can be a word that's broadly used and interchangeably used with the idea of the Canaanites, for example, in some contexts. So that's what we have going on here. So Israel is basically approaching the Jordan River from the east. You've got the Amorites and King Og in the north. You've got Sihon, the Amorite king, in the south. And then you've got Moab. We're going to see that this context will also involve Balak, the king of the Moabite king as well. So these are all kings who are watching this newcomer come in and move into claimed territory, and there's going to be a conflict. In chapter 21, we won't cover all the details, but we'll move over there and see the aftermath. Chapter 21, verse 21 through 26. Spence, could you read that for us? Chapter 21, verse 21 through 26.
Get back to Numbers.
Oh, okay.
So 21, 26.
21 through 26.
Israel sent messengers to
Sihon.
King of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your land. We will not turn aside into field or vineyard. We will not drink the water of a well. We will go on the king's highway until we have passed through your territory. But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. He gathered all his people together and went out against Israel through the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. And Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword, took possession of his land from Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as to the Ammonites, for the border of the Ammonites was strong. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in all these cities, and the Amorites, and Heshbon, and all its villages. Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab, and had taken all his land out of his hand as far as the Arnon.
So technically, really, we're starting to see the conquest of Canaan, or the Canaanites here, starting to take place with these battles, these initial battles. But it's interesting here, and this is the kind of battle that we were looking for. The Lord, Yahweh is his name. He's the one who's won the battles for Israel, right? His reputation, his name is now being felt and heard and experienced now amongst the Canaanites who are in the land. So that's important. Now what we have is an interesting kind of interlude, a side kind of story that comes in here in the book of Numbers. This one's going to involve the Moabite king, Balak. And this is, like I said, kind of the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. King Balak calls on divine guidance. He's looking for some answers. He summons this somewhat mysterious prophet, Balaam, who, as far as we know, is a prophet of great reputation. Let's see here in chapter 22. Let's look at verses 1 through 4. And let's see. James, could you read for us in chapter 22, verses 1 through 4?
Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped around the Jordan across from the Jericho. Now,
Balak,
son of Zippor, all that Israelites had done to the Ammonites, and the Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. Moab said to the elders of God is going to lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field. So Balak, son of Zippor, was king of Moab at that time.
Okay. And so verse 5, he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river, in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Behold, a people came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the land, and they are living opposite me. So there's a situation here. But see, Balaam is a prophet, but he's not a prophet of Israel. He's a kind of like a prophet for hire. Prophets would have been around in the ancient world at that time. And there's going to be 4 rounds here, you might say, of conversation between Balak and Balaam with regards to Israel. So King Balak is going to send elders to find Balaam. The elders find Balaam, and they find that Balaam is preparing to hear from, of all gods, somebody that we've heard of before, capital Lord. We see that in chapter 22, verse 8. So the elders who the king of Moab, Balak, sends, they say to him, spend the night here, and I will bring, that's Balaam's words in verse 8. Balaam responds to these elders, spend the night here, and I will bring word back to you, as Yahweh may speak to me. And the leaders of Moab stayed with Balaam. So what's interesting about this is somewhat, it's a little interesting. It seems as if Balaam and God may have a familiar relationship here. Who is this Balaam? God came to Balaam in verse 9 and says, who are these men with you? Balaam says to God, Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent word to me. Behold, there is a people whom came out of Egypt, and they cover the surface of the land. Now, this is what he asks me to do. Come, curse them for me. Perhaps I may be able to fight against them and drive them out. What's interesting about this is Balaam is addressing the very God who brought this group of people out of Egypt. Remember, we go back. Israel, don't forget, I am Yahweh. I am the God, Yahweh, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, right? God says to Balaam, do not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are to be blessed. Now, it's interesting here, I think, that we have to remind ourselves God's informing Balaam of some correct theology here. This is a people who've been asked to curse by the king of Moab, but I'm telling you, as Yahweh, Balaam, you're to bless them, because I'm the one who made a promise to the patriarchs that any nation who would be blessing you would become a blessed. You Israel, or through you Abraham, you'll be a blessing to the nations. Anybody who curses you will be cursed. Anybody who blesses you will be blessed. There's blessing implications here. So it's interesting, as this will eventually get us and point us to some interesting truth about God. All right, so there seems to be a subtle allusion to the fact that here I think it's clear this is the God who is the one who brought Israel out of Egypt. And we see that in verse 11. And that's a reference back to Genesis 12:3. So the way ahead for Balaam is to bless Israel. That's the point that we see here early on in this narrative. So the first group of Balak's elders return to the king with bad news, and King Balak is going to return more elders, and he's going to kind of raise the financial interest or stakes in terms of the exchange. And we see here in Balaam, in terms of his reply, Balaam says in verse 18 and 19, Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, though Balak were to give me his house, doesn't matter how much he gives me, full of silver and gold, I could not do anything, either small or great, contrary to the command of Yahweh my God. That's interesting. So while he didn't maybe at first show up as a prophet Israel, it seems like he's becoming one pretty quickly, right? In terms of the narrative as it unfolds. Now the emphasis on capital Lord, and we see that here in verse 18. All right, so we keep going here. Balaam is going to leave with this group of elders, and return to Balak. And we see in verse 22 something that kind of raises our attention a little bit. Verse 22, but God was angry because he was going, that is Balaam. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. Now he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. What's interesting, and what comes out as a bit of surprise if you've ever looked at this closely, this anger. Why is the Lord angry with Balaam at this point? And I think that some of the clues that we've been given might help us a little bit to understand what might be going on here, although I'm sure the interpretive options are out there. But look at verse 20. God came to Balaam at night and said, if the men have come to call you, rise up and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you shall you do. Here's my my interpretation of the anger, or the divine anger against the prophet Balaam at this point. See, in the ancient world, sometimes pagan prophets were able to move into a scenario and make the gods say whatever they wanted to say, because they were false prophets. Pagan prophets could manipulate situations by putting words in the mouth of the gods. But what's interesting in this context, Balaam is formerly a pagan prophet, but now he's become officially designated as a prophet speaking for God. And in this case, if Balaam has any intentions of going and manipulating the situation, putting words in the mouth of Yahweh, that's a no-no. So there's some anger here at first, and that kind of sets us up for this donkey encounter. It's just around the corner, right? The focus is now on Balaam speaking the words of Yahweh. All right? So this is the conflict that we see in verse 29. Let's look at a little bit of it. And see, Weston over here, could you read in verse 29 through 31?
You said 29, not 39, 29 through 30.
Chapter 22, beginning in verse 29, down through 31.
Balaam said to the donkey, because you have made a fool of me, I wish I had a sword in my hand, for then I would kill you. And the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life long to this day? It is my habit to treat you this way. And he said, no.
Keep going. Verse 31.
And the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed down and fell on his face.
I mean, it's a little bit comical, but the humor is the divine sense of humor here. If God can speak through a donkey, God can certainly speak through a pagan prophet, and he's going to. He's going to have, his words will come through Balaam, regardless of Balaam's approach, and the Lord is, getting him and pointing him in the right direction through this shocking experience. Balaam apparently learns his lesson pretty quickly. If we look down to verse 38, so Balaam says to Balak, king, so this is the king of Moab, quote, behold, I've come to you now. Am I able to speak anything at all? The word that God puts in my mouth, that I shall speak. So what we see here, we're reminded of the pagan context that we're dealing with here. Verse 41, so then it came about in the morning that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal. And he saw from there a portion of the people. So he's taking them up to kind of scout out the situation. He's still expecting Balaam to deliver a curse against the Israelite encampment, right? So that's what we have there. Let's wrap this up in chapter 23 and verses 7 through 10. Let's have Lisa up here. Could I have you read, please?
7 through 10?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And Balaam took up his discourse and said, from around Balak has brought me, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come curse Jacob for me, and come denounce Israel. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? And how can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? For from the top of the crags I see him, from the hills I behold him. Behold, a people dwelling alone, and not counting itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the fourth part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like his.
Yeah, it's interesting. We start to see in the actual blessing, right, that's coming from Balaam, this prophet, we see echoes, or we hear echoes, right, of previous, words of blessing. And in this case, we have some echoes coming from places like Genesis 15:5 and Genesis 17:7. Remember those passages where the Lord says, this is the extent of my blessing, as numerous as the stars of heaven, as numerous as the sands of the sea. And some of that. And we have here a reference to the dust. So I think it's kind of that same idea. Now we continue on as Balaam is now taking a look at the Israelite camp. Balak takes him up to oversee and look at the Israelite camp so he can curse them. Instead, we hear yet another blessing from the prophet Balaam. Let's see here. Garnett? No, he's not here today. Amanda, where are you? There you are. Read for us in verse 18, now that we have the second blessing here from the prophet, 18 through 24. Go ahead.
And Balaam took up his discourse and said, rise, Balak, and hear, give me ear, O son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and he will not do it? Or has he spoken, and he will not fulfill it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. He has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord their God is with them, and the shout of the king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt, and is for them like the horns of the wild ox. For there is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what has God wrought? Behold, O people, as a lioness it rises up, and as a lion it lifts itself. It does not lie down until it has devoured the prey and drunk the blood of the slain.
Okay, just a couple of subtle allusions here I'll point out. Reference in 21, in verse 21 there, this idea of the shout of the king is among them. And in combination with verse 24, this reference to the lion, Lion of Judah, one of the blessings that we see back in Genesis 49, where Jacob blesses his sons. Let's remind ourselves of what that looks like. Chapter 49, verses 9 and 10. So might be something going on here, 9 and 10. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Remember that scepter idea refers to the king. So the king-lion connection seems to be showing up here a little bit in this prophecy from the some unexpected prophet here that we have in Balaam. So finally, the reference to the lion. Now we have a third blessing, and by this time it seems a little more obvious that Balaam is kind of getting caught up in the full experience. He's experiencing a transformation. And in this oracle, we have chapter 24, verses 2 through 9. So let's see, Kevin up here. Could you read for us? Chapter 24, 2 through 9.
Chapter 24, what?
2 through 9. So this is blessing number 3, I think we're on.
Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. He took up his discourse and said, The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eyes is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seat shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces, and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness who will rouse him up. Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you.
So there's a direct quote from the Abrahamic covenant. We see the language that's used here, the Spirit of God comes upon him. So that sounds like a prophet of Israel, finally. And you see a reference here. He's now receiving this full vision of El Shaddai in verse 4, the Almighty. And a reference here to the, let's see, that's verse 8 is really something that kind of struck me in terms of God brings him out of Egypt. So again, we're back to the idea of this. Who is this God? He's the one who brought this whole nation out of Egypt. Yahweh is his name. So it's interesting we have this continuity there as well. One last oracle or blessing comes in verses 15 through 17 down here in chapter 24. So Balak's not going to like this. He's continuing to bless and not curse. But yet Balaam is holding his own. He took up his discourse and says, The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eyes opened. The oracle of him who hears the words of God, verse 16, and knows knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down and yet having his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. Wow, who's he seeing there? Kind of like distant, kind of far off. This prophet Balaam, now he's getting a pretty intense vision that seems to be bringing in more than just a few echoes of some patriarchal promises and the Abrahamic covenant. Now he's starting to see maybe just a glimpse. Maybe this can be, maybe I'm overstating it, but who do you think this describes? Right? Who's this coming king? God, I see him, but but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall arise from Israel. It's like a distant echo of something that's coming. So maybe this is the beginning of the vision that will focus all of the prophets to come on the coming king who's coming. This is God himself who's coming as king to take care of the situation. All right. Well, after this, Balaam will return to his place, only to be killed in the defeat of the Midianites in chapter 31, verse 8. Unfortunate end to this prophet. It's just... now let's finish the book of Numbers. Israel's going to remain in the territory of Moab. Now that they have a relative time of peace, they're settling down and they're camped out. Moses is going to have them there on the plains of Moab. But problems quickly begin to arise, almost like another golden calf episode. We see the influence of paganism and how quickly Israel is to run towards it. So Israel's decided here in chapter 25 to stop and have breakfast at the International House of Baal. Y'all see that? Boo, boo hiss. International House of Baal. There you go. Now we remind ourselves that Baal is this fertility god of the Canaanites, right? And when he's the one who is responsible for fertility of crops and livestock. But when you go to the temple of Baal, there's more than just goes on than just singing songs and hearing a good sermon. So the Canaanites are already involved in bringing in prostitution that connects to the fertility idea. So this is the early syncretism that we start to see. This is the lure of these kinds of pagan cults, pagan religious focuses coming from paganism. All right. Now we're going to have some severe response. This offense that we see in chapter 25. Israel remained at Shittim. You have to say that carefully. Shittim. The people began to play the harlot in verse 1. Playing the harlot with the daughters of Moab. Those are the pagan prostitutes right there. That's what's going on. For they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel joined themselves to Baal of Peor, localized Canaanite deity, and the Lord was angry against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take the leaders of the people, take them out in broad daylight before the Lord, and stone them or something, execute them. That sounds kind of harsh, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may burn and not turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you slay his men, those who have joined themselves to Baal of Peor. Capital punishment. This is a crime against the covenant community. What was at stake? The name, reputation of the Lord, but also the vitality and very life and existence of God's people. A crime like this was treated like, and in the same way as we'll see when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, this is worthy of capital offense. This is a capital offense and will bring in immediate response, in this case the death penalty. A harsh crime, but it's a crime that was committed willfully in putting the benefit and welfare of everyone was at jeopardy. So we're going to see some of these capital offense crimes detailed out when we get to the book of Deuteronomy. All right. Last but not least, we have another census in chapter 26 for a new generation. This is the generation that's come out of the wilderness. This is the generation that will take the land. Joshua will take over leadership in chapter 27, and we see that in verses 15 through 23. We won't read all of that. Moses speaks to the Lord, saying, may the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, may not be like sheep don't have a shepherd. So the Lord says to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom the capital S spirit and is in, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest, and before all of the congregation and commission him in their sight. And put some of your authority on him in order that the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. So we have this handing of the baton, and but Moses will continue his teaching ministry throughout the book of Deuteronomy, but he himself will not be allowed to enter into the promised land. We have some significant instructions here at the end of the book of Numbers in chapter 33, beginning in verse 50. Let's see here. And Scott, I want you to read in chapter 33, beginning in verse 50. The law of possessing the land.
What chapter you say?
Chapter 33.
What verse did you say?
Till I tell you to stop.
Starting at what?
Start in verse 50.
I got thrown off by the knee.
Okay.
And the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When you pass over the Jordan to the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. You shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance. To a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. And I will do to you as I thought to do to them.
Have you ever gotten a bad thorn? Right in the middle of a nice hike, that's why you wear those thick-soled shoes, but if you're hiking in tennis shoes, you get thorns if you step in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, here's this little passage here is going to help us if we put a little peg here, because what we're going to see is this play out. So in the book of Joshua, as we get there, we have to remind ourselves of this passage, because Joshua will basically give us the conquest, but what we'll learn is that it was incomplete. Joshua didn't fully drive out all of in this case, the pagan nations, to make space for God's people to have church and to express their covenant relationship with God, to be the kingdom of priests and holy nations. And because of, it's kind of nicely stated here, but the problem that we have, pricks in eyes and thorns in your side, and they shall trouble you. It's not just about a little bit of hassling every now and then. Oh, some of those pagans climbed the fence and stole some of our goats. Not that. It's the pagan influence that they'll eventually bring in and that Israel will adopt. They should have been driven out so that the lingering influence doesn't come in. Because what's at stake? It's the reputation of God amongst His people to be expressed to the watching world, to the nations around are supposed to see something radically different in Israel, this holy nation, this kingdom of priests and holy nation. But when that doesn't happen, it's more than just a problem. It will lead to exile, because then Israel will eventually show up and look no different than the pagan nations around them. See? That's where this could go. It's syncretism. And so there's a lot at stake in this early portion of Israel's salvation history. So there's a huge theological content here, and you're going to see that when we get to the book of Judges, theologically, the author of Judges is going to amplify the whole pricks and thorns language. And he'll basically say the nations that are unconquered, they'll be in place, guess what? To test you. God will use the unconquered nations to refine you and to test you and to be the heat and the fire to melt the gold all over again. So there's a 400-year period that we see in the book of Judges where we start to see the syncretism take over. And the only thing that can come on to the scene that would maybe turn the tide is God to raise up another prophet named Samuel, who will eventually get us to Israel's first true king, King David. And then we start to see, hopefully, change at that point, but we'll have to wait to see. That'll be my class in the spring. All right, one last thing. So with the conflict of over Moab and King Balak is over, Israel can establish herself. This is the plains of Moab. And from that slightly high elevated area, you can see in the distance the green part. Right along in the middle of this slide, that's the Jordan River. So within eye, visually, you can see the Jordan River. That's the river that Moses continues to refer to, and to, now I would argue, point to for every one of his sermons, his instructional sermons that we have collected and written down that constitutes the book of Deuteronomy. Some of the best preaching sermons that you'll see, if you read Deuteronomy, read it out loud, and you're hearing some very fine preaching. And you should read it that way with emphasis. All right? So this is Kadesh Barnea, and this is where they're hanging out. This is a generation that hopefully has been produced, and the generation that Moses will address here at the end of the wilderness experience, now that they're out of it, this is the generation that's come back to my famous picture. Now they're the ones with the heart and feet and ears. All right, so in as I've said before, it's really a poorly drawn picture, but hopefully it illustrates, right? There's one word that's going to show up in Deuteronomy. It's the most famous verse for any Jew. If you meet somebody on the street who's a practicing Jew, just say the word Shema, and they'll be able to say the rest of the verse in Hebrew. It's the connection of the hearing with the obedience. There's one word, Shema, that means both hear and obey. So that's the generation, hopefully, that we've had come out of the wilderness experience for 40 years. They've learned the lesson of the wilderness. The wilderness experience teaches them this, to become this kind of faithful Israelite, a heart with feet. So that's what we have. And as we transition to the book of Deuteronomy, Deutero, on me, Latin for two, Deutero, on me. There you go, that's the picture. Did you catch that? No? That was kind of stupid, wasn't it? Okay. Scott told me at break, though, he really enjoys these pictures. So, yeah, he's really digging these pictures. Yeah. All right. Let's move on quickly. So Moses, the author here of the Pentateuch, he's putting down his magnum opus, Mr. Holland's opus. Great movie. What's that thing that you write at the end that's just going to change the world? So the Deuteronomy, here's another way to think of the book of Deuteronomy. It is the Romans of the Old Testament. Kind of like that. Deuteronomy presents the foundational theology that forms the basis for all subsequent Old Testament books. You can't understand the history books like 2 Samuel, or the wisdom books like Psalms, or the prophetic books like Jeremiah, without understanding Deuteronomy. Because those authors, those poets, those prophets, guess where they're going to go get their theology for explaining the situation in their world at that particular time, when things are chaotic, when things are bursting at the seams and all beep is breaking loose. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. You have to edit that out of the recording. They go back to Deuteronomy, because Moses is going to explain the foundation of covenant relationship and what it will look like for Israel, for a God who's unreservedly committed, unwaveringly committed to his people, regardless of which direction they go with the obedience thing, how he'll respond. That's what Deuteronomy unpacks. So, all right. Deuteronomy will provide the theology then for the prophets who wrestle with the exiles, who are asking, why are we here in exile? The prophets are going to be the ones that go back to Deuteronomy to bring the theology of Moses into their current situation. With regards to the New Testament, you can't understand Paul, can't understand the words of Christ unless you understand Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy was their favorite book. And if you look at Revelations, it quotes or alludes to the last book of the Bible. It alludes to Deuteronomy more than any other Old Testament book. How's that for Deuteronomy? Oftentimes unread in our churches. So it represents this classroom experience. Moses, his instructional sermons, a series of sermons that he's unpacking and writing down, as we'll see. And it's the finest example of Old Testament preaching, I think. A little bit about the composition of Deuteronomy. And I follow a scholar named Dwayne Garrett who teaches up at Southern. I never had him for a class, but he came after I left. But 4 basic stages of the book of Deuteronomy we could talk about. An oral stage. Really what we're talking about here in terms of the composition of the Pentateuch, really as a whole, is what I wanted to say, not just Deuteronomy. So the oral stage, now that's an early stage. The early patriarchal traditions would have maybe existed when Moses, the author, comes onto the scene, preserved orally, perhaps written down, but talking to us about the patriarchal traditions. And then there's a written stage. Eventually, these oral traditions would have been written down. Moses would have had access to those written traditions, perhaps as an active author. His insight into the whole world of the patriarchs while he's in Egypt and while he's being called by God to take this people out. Then we have the Moses stage. That's the 3rd stage. We talked about Moses being an educated author, leader, trained in all of the the treaty forms and how to formulate treaty relationships and all of that legal language and all of that Moses would have learned as he grew up in the household of Pharaoh. Moses is going to be the one to write down this teaching and instruction, but along the way, as Israel travels all the way out of Egypt through 40 years in the wilderness and finally in the plains of Moab, all of this becomes a corpus of things written down. I throw it into a portable filing cabinet, and it's portable, travels with Israel, and is handed off to Joshua and the new generation of leadership as they enter into the land of Canaan. And finally, we have what we would call post-Moses stage. There'll probably be a little bit of updating over the history. There's a whole scribal tradition of copying down the book. I think one of the things that's probably not attributed to Moses is the very last chapter. I have to say, probably as a fitting tribute to the author, the account that summarizes Moses' death. Moses doesn't write that down himself. It's probably written down by a scribe of Joshua to pay proper tribute to the author of the whole corpus and added as a tribute to the author. And that would be representing kind of a post-Moses stage. What's interesting, though, specifically about the book of Deuteronomy, and we talked about this a little bit, is how nicely it fits into, in terms of its kind of overall structure and form, how its treaty formation or its treaty structure lines up well with the 2nd millennial BC Hittite treaties that would have been right on top of and around the context for an active author writing at that same time. So if we line those up, and we did this in more detail earlier in the semester when we kind of argued against the documentary hypothesis. Remember that? We had a long discussion about this. The basic, you might say the first level subhead titles are preamble, historical introduction, stipulations, document clause, the God list, if you're looking at the Hittite form or the non-biblical form, and then finally a section of curses and blessings. what's interesting about Deuteronomy is we have the same kind of organizational structure show up. We have a preamble, that's just at the beginning there of chapter 1, and then the historical section, chapter 1, basically to the end of chapter 4. We have a long section of stipulations. Those are the instructions, right? We'll look at a few of those, chapter 5 through 26. And we have a document clause, chapter 27, a cursing and blessing section, 28, chapter 28 largely there. What's missing? The God list. Why would that be? We have a problem here? It's interesting. It actually adds a little more oomph or evidence for the fact that this is probably coming from Moses, because he leaves it out because he's talking about one. It's Yahweh is his name. We don't have to list the God list. We're not talking about pagan gods who are witnesses to this thing. God is the witness. Israel, this is a kind of covenant relationship between one God, the one true God, and his nation Israel. So that's what we have. So if we look at Deuteronomy chapter, let's go to Deuteronomy and open it up. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Let's, I'm saying, does anybody need a break? Let's maybe go a little bit longer and let you out a little bit early. How's that? Like that? Oh man, it's a little too eager back there in the back row. I might change my mind. No, I won't. Okay. So Deuteronomy chapter 4. I mean, if you read this out loud, Moses is preaching here in chapter 4, like verse, what do I have here? Verse 5. Can you picture Moses preaching? See, I've taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. Now I'm pointing, I'm acting out what Moses might be doing to illustrate further his sermon, where you're going. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who will hear of all of these statutes and say, quote, surely this great nation is wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord, Yahweh our God, whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole Torah, which I'm setting before you, plop down today? Kind of see him doing that, right? You know, he's got, and so only give heed. Give heed is the idea of the Shema word that means hear and obey. Whenever you see give heed, it's hearing and it's the obedience combined, is what we have going on in the Hebrew. And keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, unlike the generation before you, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and make them known to your sons and to your grandsons. So there's so much there, right? It really sings when you can read it out loud and preach. We'll probably, let's see, one more slide and then we'll wrap up for the day. So again, Israel's on the plains of Moab, and for Moses, it's interesting that he back in chapter 1. Where does he begin his historical prologue, his recounting of history for Israel in his document structure? Where does he begin? In chapter 1, verse 5. Let's look at that. Chapter 1, verse 5. Across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this Torah. Get in the practice of saying Torah when you see the word law, when you teach and preach, right? It's that word that comes from the idea of instruction, all right? It's not law. Law versus grace. Well, we're not there with this. This is necessary instruction, preparation for the what next for Israel. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, quote, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. So he starts at Mount Sinai. He goes back to the wedding day, to begin his historical. It's not that long ago. Well, it's longer than 40 years ago now, but the wilderness generation needed to be reminded again, this new generation, of their historical beginnings. Where did this all begin? He goes back to Mount Sinai. That's where Moses goes. And then he's recounting this as a reaffirmation of this covenant relationship. The Sinai covenant is going to be brought back into and recounted and reaffirmed for this new generation. That's one of the functions of the book of Deuteronomy and what Moses does. So in chapter 1, we won't read all of these verses, but I'll just some of the things that are part of the historical prologue here. Verses 6 through 18 are going to recount and highlight the activity that took place at Mount Sinai. So that's what we have here, with a focus on the organization and delegation of leadership, the assignment of judges, and all of those things that were important. Verses 19 in chapter 1 through 46 is going to recount the events that happened at Kadesh Barnea. So that's the precipitating event that started the whole wilderness experience, and that's going to be recounted. So this is the huge mistake. Moses is saying, let's not forget what happened at Kadesh Barnea. Let's not repeat that mistake again. This is you are the wilderness generation. You've come out of that experience, and you're not going to make this mistake again. Let's see, chapter 2 in the historical prologue, in the first couple, 16 verses there, it's going to recount the 38 years of the wilderness journey are going to be recounted. And some of the conflicts that Israel has along the way are also going to be brought into the remembrance of this historical prologue. Chapter 2, verses 14 through 16 will put special emphasis on that generation of the fighting men who grumbled and complained and weren't allowed to enter into the promised land. And then finally, the historical prologue will recount in verses 17 through 37 the whole conflict with Sihon and Og, those Canaanite kings, if you remember there at the book of Numbers. Chapter 3, verse 21 through 22 is going to focus on Joshua, and now the handing of baton of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And let's look at that, and we'll end for today. I just want to remind ourselves of chapter 3, verse 21 through 22. So, chapter 3, verse 21. And I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings, Sihon and Og. So the Lord shall do to all of the kingdoms into which you are about to cross. Remember, we talked about these early victories for Israel were significant because they maybe reaffirmed for Israel, hey, we can do this when the Lord has our back. We don't have the biggest army around. Some of these cities that we'll eventually get to are going to have walls around them. How are we going to win those battles? Well, it's like this. Moses is saying, do not fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. And what's interesting, when we get to the book of Joshua, when he has his halftime speech, we'll get there, when he encourages Israel, hey, now we're ready to put feet to this, the battle's starting, how many times does he say, but be strong and courageous, right? Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. 3 times. Yeah, you got it. It comes from, this encouragement. Moses is reminding them of all of these things. Is that all I want to say there? Yeah. So finally, in chapter 4, we won't read it. It's a great chapter to read out loud. It sounds like a very famous speech, like the Gettysburg Address. Someone comes on and steps in at a critical juncture in history and speaks and changes history, just like Abraham Lincoln did. And read chapter 4 of Deuteronomy 1 through 40 out loud. So we'll go to the very end of chapter 4. I won't read it out loud. Sometimes I do, but it's too much for today. In verse 44, we have an interesting reference. So remember, the historical prologue goes all the way to the end, chapter 1, all the way through chapter 4, verse 40, right at the end there. And then, in verse 41, then Moses set apart 3 cities across the Jordan to the east. We'll cover those later. Let's look at verse 44. Now this is the Torah which Moses set before the sons of Israel. What he's referring to is what's to come. This is the Torah. So from this point on, what we begin to see here is a recounting of the 10 Commandments, the foundations laid in chapter 5, and then we start to see these ongoing collection of teachings and instructions and stipulations and commandments and judgments and all of those things that are referred to. Moses is simply waking up, getting people together, and hearing from the Lord and instructing them. So he says that in verse 45. These are the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out of Egypt, across the Jordan in the valley opposite Beth Peor, and the land of Sihon king of the Amorites who lived at Heshbon, whom Moses and the sons of Israel defeated when they came out of Egypt. By the way, Yahweh is his name, the God who got them out of Egypt. And they took possession of his land in the land of Og, king of Bashan, and 2 kings of the Amorites who were across the Jordan to the east. I don't know if I had to read all of that. I just wanted to show that this is the Torah. So verse 44 is the word Torah, which is now being referred to or being used to refer to the whole corpus. Does that make sense? So the Torah is going back to Genesis 1, but now it's including the very product in which Moses is now writing and completing as the capstone of the Pentateuch. So there's this sense, even in the book of Deuteronomy, the writing process that Moses is involved in, the communication process that Moses is involved in, the author who's active. All right? So we'll save this